Hey everyone, this is going to serve as a kind of intro to Heidegger and Heidegger's thought. Brief lecture for you. There's nothing fancy about this. I'm working on some dumb little videos that hopefully will keep you entertained and explain three of the key concepts from Heidegger that I really want you to take away from this course. Those concepts are the idea of world, the worldliness of the world, which I think is really, really important to think about in connection with the second thing, which is a new way of thinking about being, specifically thinking about the being of humans. Okay. Heidegger is very particular that he doesn't just mean human beings because of the history that the word human has in connection with it, but by and large, he's talking about a new way to be a human being. And then third, this idea of how the world appears to me, and that sort of connected with the things that I use and what that means. So those are three shorter videos. They're probably going to be about 5 minutes each that I'm working on this week and next week. And these are the 2 weeks that we're going to be talking about Heidegger because he's that big and important of a figure. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into the type of lecture and sort of really like guided discussion intro that I normally would do for this course. All right. So without further ado, let's talk about good old Uncle Martin. So Martin Heidegger is perhaps the largest shadow that looms over the history of Western philosophy in the 20th century. And he's born in Germany in 1889 and grows up initially studying theology because he wants to be a Catholic priest. But in seminary, he becomes a Lutheran and then changes his area of study yet again to philosophy. At the University of Freiburg, Heidegger is influenced by Neo-Thomism and Neo-Kantianism, but also the founder of phenomenology, a guy named Edmund Husserl. Now, I want to talk briefly about Husserl because we don't really get a chance to talk about him in this class. We're not going to read Husserl, but it's important to note that his phenomenological method became a major intellectual force in the 20th century, specifically in Europe, and it remains an extremely influential form of philosophical analysis to this day. Those of you who are in global philosophy will note that phenomenology, Husserlian phenomenology in particular, is the sort of thing that Linda Martine Alcoff talked about quite a bit in her article that we read for the class. Real Identities, that was the name of it. And so this method inspired a lot of folks. Husserl's intellectual children included Heidegger, but also Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Emmanuel Levinas, Paul Ricoeur, Jacques Derrida, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and many others. Now, phenomenology is a philosophical method that expanded beyond the limitations of philosophy to find adherents in many of the social sciences, as well as a significant influence over filmmakers, musicians, and painters of the time. One of the reasons why I did that weird, goofy, almost like film noir French New Wave video for Kierkegaard is because Kierkegaard was deeply influential on existential filmmakers, one of which is a guy named Jean-Luc Godard, who really inspired a lot of French New Wave cinema, which, if you don't know what that is, just think like Wes Anderson, but old and way more serious. That's French New Wave. Wes Anderson's doing some other stuff that's very cool, especially drawing from other more contemporary influences, but existentialism is all over film, and existentialism arises as a reaction to and as being influenced by Husserl's idea of phenomenology, along with other folks like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Anyway, let's get back to Husserl. So Husserl conceives of phenomenology as a way of doing philosophy as what he calls a rigorous science. And his method can be summed up in the phrase die Sache selbst, or to the things themselves. Now, what he means by this is complicated, but I'll try to break it down for you. Philosophy often proceeds to its object of inquiry without examining its own presuppositions. That is, we bring the full complement of our experiences and values to bear on any objects that we encounter. To counter this tendency, Husserl charges philosophers with the task of bracketing those presuppositions in a move he calls the phenomenological reduction. Now, this reduction is not unlike making a reduction when cooking, where you have an excess of water and you cook it off until you have a kind of undiluted, thicker flavor left over. The things themselves, or the matters themselves, are precisely what remains after a reduction. Now, eventually, we do get everything from behind the reduction back, but we can't... Oh, hold on a second. I messed up. Okay, yeah. But we can't claim to encounter objects as they give themselves without first suspending our judgments and presuppositions about it. Heidegger will do something different with this method of phenomenology, in large part because he's attempting to redirect the method and to situate it within a history of Western philosophy that Heidegger knew far more thoroughly than Husserl. There's some scholarly argument about this, but Husserl was a mathematician for much of his life and came to philosophy later, and it's speculated that most of his philosophical history was really just Descartes, Kant, and contemporary German philosophy, guys like Frege, who were contemporaries of his, whereas Heidegger knew all of that really well. I mean, Heidegger is a student of the history of philosophy. Now, he eventually gets a teaching position, Heidegger does, at the University of Marburg, before taking over Husserl's position at Freiburg. And in 1933, Heidegger becomes the chancellor of the entire German university system. He essentially becomes the kind of head of their department of education. And he delivers what is now a rather infamous address. It's called the Rectorship Address. It's important to read his other work in light of this piece because of his relationship to Nazism. To be a rector of the entire German university in 1933 meant that Heidegger was a Nazi, and he remained one until 1945. The relationship between his thought and Nazism is also an area of scholarly dispute, but at least one philosopher found his relation to Hitler unforgivable. Emmanuel Levinas, Jewish phenomenologist and sometime student of Heidegger's, said that Heidegger was, on the one hand, the most important philosopher from the West of the 20th century. And he also said that he could not forgive him for his Nazi sympathies. Indeed, Levinas' own work can be seen as a repudiation of Heidegger's ideas due to their philosophical connection to ideas of Nazism. Now, as I talked about with Kant way back when we were all face-to-face, Heidegger is the type of figure similar to Kant, similar to Hegel, similar to Descartes, where their influence is so great that even if you disagree with them, you have to encounter and wrestle with them. And that's true of Heidegger. Much of the 20th century in Western philosophy is wrestling with figures such as Heidegger, even if you disagree with them. After the war, World War II that is, Heidegger is barred from teaching, and for a while he just sort of wanders about giving lectures here or there, but he eventually returns to the academic stage, and he becomes the shadow over the history of 20th century European philosophy, for the most part. He spends a full decade, lecturing on Nietzsche, which is one of the main reasons why everybody else in European philosophy starts reading Nietzsche very seriously. Heidegger also becomes really interested in technology and wrote several very important essays on the subject. But for our purposes, being and time, his so-called magnum opus, will be the main point of interest. Later Heideggers for another class, probably in grad school. But for now, we are going to focus on the big ideas that he brings to the table and how they are going to change what we talk about going forward. Now, I want to pause here before I get a little bit into how to read Heidegger to mention two things. One, just like with Kant and Hegel, Heidegger invents a vocabulary. And everybody who wants to go forward with those types of arguments has to wrestle with that vocabulary. The other thing I'll mention, this is more of a practical thing, is that there's a paper on D2L called How to Read Heidegger that I have put up for you. It's based off of a book, very, very good book by a philosopher named Mark Rathall called How to Read Heidegger, that I would highly suggest to you if you can get your hands on some sort of legal digital copy. And that will help you understand some of the more nuanced things going on when you're reading Heidegger's thought. Okay? So, let's jump back into it. The language he uses, like I said, it's very particular and peculiar, and he adopts this German tradition of taking very ordinary and everyday words and investing them with philosophical technicality. The result is that translators have a very difficult task conveying both the everydayness of the words themselves and the novelty that Heidegger uses with redefining them. Many readers of Heidegger, as a result, don't move past their initial frustration with the text and end up with a very porous and negative view of him. However, if we read slowly and carefully, Heidegger rewards readers with genuine philosophical insight. As Heidegger himself taught, all understanding moves in a circle. We use the author's description to lead us to understand the subject under discussion, and we use our own apprehension of that subject as a clue to deciphering the author's description. As we move back and forth between the description and the thing described, our understanding of both is enriched, and that is precisely how one should read Heidegger. Let his descriptions teach you how to see things even as you let the things themselves guide your interpretation of his terms. Heidegger's philosophical method consists in resolving philosophical problems by describing the phenomenon at the root of the problem in such a way that it can be seen as free of any distortion. That is a quote from the aforementioned How to Read Heidegger by Mark Rathall. Again, cannot recommend that book enough as a really good companion for being in time in particular. Although any Heidegger, it's a very, very quality descriptive read. No pun intended. What we focus on when we read Heidegger is not only the specific terms that he uses, but the ways he uses these terms. He's trying to make us aware of a particular kind of experience or some particular problem by laying out all the parameters to that problem. Thus, he might seem to write in circles, but these circles are always adding something new. So as you're reading Heidegger, I want you to keep this in mind. One, that he is drawing from the history of philosophy, and oftentimes arguments will be in connection with other arguments much more well known in certain facets of the history of philosophy. Two, his thought leads him to dangerous places. Namely, his thought leads him into an alignment with Nazism. And that is something not to take lightly. We have to think as good philosophers about where our thought will take us and what the consequences of that might be. And then finally, we need to always be mindful to read as charitably as possible, because we never know what we'll find out. So enjoy reading, and I will talk to you later.